Hi everyone. Well, today is day 3 officially of COP27, and we've seen the end of the World Leaders Summit, and all the world leaders obviously heading home today, and the agenda really starts proper today in terms of the technical negotiations. And it's been very striking over the last 2 days, and quite sad really to see how many more countries are coming forward and giving these kinds of speeches where they're almost pleading with other world leaders to try and cut emissions as quickly as possible and really up commitments on climate change adaptation as well. 10-15 years ago we would have seen 1 or 2 small island states doing that, and now we're seeing a whole ream of countries coming forward. And in particular, we've seen Pakistan taking the floor and talking about the horrendous flooding that's happened across the country this year, covering at times up to a third of the land area across Pakistan, which is absolutely extraordinary. And the government described it at the time as the worst flooding they had ever seen. Also kicking off today, one of the big items on the agenda will be the issue of loss and damage, and this was the thing that was really keeping the agenda negotiations going through the night at the start of the conference. So it's the first time that loss and damage has been on the formal COP agenda. And what that means is that countries will be discussing a whole raft of different measures that could be brought forward to help compensate nations that have been least contributing to the climate change crisis but are now suffering most. And although we haven't seen, a huge number of commitments coming forward from developed nations as yet, we have seen a few. So New Zealand, Austria and Scotland have already come forward with financial commitments. And we'll have to see where those negotiations go, but that's going to be one to watch and a real headline agenda item over the next few weeks. The other issue of note for today is going to be finance, and it's actually Finance Day at COP27. And it's been really fascinating to see the attention being paid to trying to call out net zero commitments that have been made by big industry, by large companies that really don't stack up. And actually I was in London yesterday having a meeting on that very topic of big industry signing up to net zero targets, almost assuming that those can be met just through offsetting alone, so not having to make significant cuts to emissions. And the UN Secretary General was calling this out yesterday and saying we need to have zero tolerance for net zero greenwashing. There's a lot more to be said on that topic, and we'll be seeing, I think, quite a few side events and around the sides of the negotiations talk about this as well, about what reaching net zero actually means and the best way to get there. And obviously very interesting for all of us involved in nature-based solutions as well. There will also be technical discussions happening about what counts as offsets through Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that and also updating you closer to the time. Now, we were very interested in the Prime Minister's speech that he did mention that climate change cannot be tackled without restoring nature, and of course we couldn't agree more. And really, what we'd really like to see from this COP is actually much better ramping up of nature commitments at home, these domestic commitments that we talk about so much in the wildlife trusts. It's really good to see the Prime Minister bringing nature to the fore in his speech, but at the same time we're seeing commitment after commitment being missed by the government on nature back home. Just 2 examples of that: we've seen the legal deadline missed for setting the Environment Act targets. That was the week before last. And we're still seeing a great deal of wrangling about what it really means to achieve 30% of land and sea restored for nature by 2030, which is a global commitment that the UK has signed up to. So Wildlife and Countryside links say that we're currently at about 3%, not anywhere near 30%. But there's a lot to look at in terms of how we measure the 30 by 30 target. That will be a topic that we'll be looking at for COP15, the biodiversity COP, later in December. But really, we're still nowhere near it, even if you do get into the nitpicking on the measurements. So that's something really that we'd like to see a lot more attention being paid to over the next year or so. And because it's Finance Day today as well, it would be remiss of me not to mention finance for adaptation specifically, as well as mitigation at home. So again, in the Prime Minister's speech, he was making new commitments for better adaptation support for developing countries. Obviously really welcome to see that. And yet we still know that natural environment and agriculture in particular are scoring bottom of the Climate Change Committee's assessments of progress on climate change adaptation as well as mitigation. And ramping up the financial support for landowners to do adaptation and mitigation together and to understand the best approaches to doing that as well is going to be really high on our agenda for the next 12 months. And a really good illustration of that is where I'm standing today. So this is Chobham Common, which is an absolutely enormous and fantastic national nature reserve, one of the biggest in the country and certainly the biggest in South East England, which is managed by Surrey Wildlife Trust on behalf of Surrey County Council. And it's incredibly special as a very rare lowland heath habitat, very important habitat for nightjars and Dartford warblers in particular, which are actually one of the bird species we might expect to see increasing in the UK due to climate change, although it's not all good news because their southern range in southern Europe is contracting sharply at the moment. Now, very sadly, back in 2020, just 2 years ago, an enormous wildfire ripped through here, destroying about 30 hectares of land just over my shoulder. And although wildfires and lowland heath habitats to some extent do go hand in hand, they are quite common on lowland heath, we know that the scale and the intensity of wildfire across the UK will be increasing with climate change, and it can take a decade or more for habitats like this to recover from the effects of wildfire. It's a really sad sight when you're actually on the train travelling into London through here, that you go from looking at this lush green and brown habitat to what is in effect a scorched landscape that goes on for a couple of minutes and then flips back to green and brown. And Surrey Wildlife Trust are working very closely with their partners to see what they can do to reduce the wildfire risk in this area. And I'll be coming back early next year to see how they're progressing and do a little video with them on some of the adaptation actions that they're taking. So that's it for today. On Friday, I'll be coming to you again from a different Wildlife Trust nature reserve, so I'll see you then.